Welcome back to the Afterword table, a conversation about the future of words. We are so glad to have Charnise, Mangle, and Lawson Wetli here with us to continue our conversation about the power of voting. Last episode was amazing. We learned so many things that we will be able to take into this election season. And sometimes, though, it seems like it's come around all the time. It's time to vote again. We're hearing all of the rhetoric. We see all the ads, and we might take for granted some of our rights and privileges until they're no longer available. So it's really important to recall the sacrifices of those who helped our society gain the right to vote. And so, Charnise, I'm going to start with you. Do you have a story of a voting rights hero or heroine that inspired you?
Yes, I would have to say Fannie Lou Hamer. Fannie Lou Hamer is just one of the most iconic heroines for civics, for voting rights that I have ever encountered in my study of being civic minded. And the reason that she's such a heroine to me is that she fought so hard that she literally placed her own life and the life of not only herself, but her husband and children in jeopardy in order to gain access to the polls. And so when I heard her story, I think for the first time was in U.S. history class at Malden High School. And I was like, that's interesting. But it wasn't really until I became a teacher and was able to educate my own students. You know, obviously the standards pay homage during the civil rights movement to the greats, you know, Malcolm X, Martin Luther King Jr., Rosa Parks. We even talk about Stokely Carmichael in there. But I actually do a project with my students where they pick an unsung civil rights activist, and they have to dive deep into research about that person. But at the end of the day, they have to synthesize all this research that's typically about 2-3 pages about who this person was and the life that they lived. And then they have to synthesize that to a very succinct 6-sentence kind of Instagram caption with a picture of them. And when I was getting together that list, I was getting it together and I came across some just wonderful women and men in the civil rights movement. And I remember seeing Fannie Lou Hamer's name again. And I was like, oh, I got to do some research about who she is, who she was, and who she was to the people that she helped to give a voice to. And so as I began to do that research and I realized that she was already doing the work, but she really took the Freedom Summer, the Mississippi Freedom Summer, to another level by going to the Democratic National Convention and essentially demanding to seat her. I mean, that I was like, when I was doing that research and hearing just the speech that she gave that was just powerful. I recommend it to anyone to go and listen at that convention. It was so powerful that they essentially cut into it. It was a television broadcast and they actually started playing. I can't remember what they started playing instead, but they cut into it because it was so powerful. They just knew that it was going to be another watershed moment in the civil rights movement, that they just couldn't allow this tiny Black woman's voice to be broadcast in the way that it was in 1964 at the Democratic National Convention. And though what her and her group wanted to get accomplished was not accomplished, she lit a fire and fanned a flame in a way that I think has never gone out. And I even say when I do things about voting today and post things, I actually post hashtag I am Fannie Lou Hamer because I want to be as powerful as her. I want her spirit to live on in young people and in old people like myself, right? So, Fannie Lou Hamer for me. That's who I'd have to say.
Wow, I love that. And I'm so glad that you brought that speech up and talked about her as a heroine, and I couldn't agree with you more. That's beautiful. How about you, Lawson?
One hero for me is Mary McLeod Bethune, who was born in South Carolina and, absolutely just stalwart hero in all kinds of rights movements, including suffrage for women, including civil rights, including all kinds of things. And, one thing that you touched on at the beginning, Amy, that I just want to underline is that 100 years ago marked the passage of the 19th Amendment, which forbade gender discrimination, having a gender bar for voting, but also many, many, many women still could not vote. And there were many women who were instrumental in achieving the 19th Amendment who did not, receive the right to vote. So, this included African American women, Chinese American women, Native American women. There were so many, and that's so much a part of what the road towards suffrage has been. It has been a long, incremental, often not complete, often not fair. If you look at some of the strategies and tactics that various parts of the women's suffrage movement used in leading up to the 19th Amendment, they were throwing people under the bus like crazy. Suffrage has always been a long and not always super photogenic or, pretty road, and that it continues, that I see women like Mary McLeod Bethune, we talk now about intersectionality, but people like Mary McLeod Bethune were intersectional before the term was there, where it's like the right to vote is an intrinsic right of humanity. It's not about some condition of femininity. It's not about something else, right? It is all related. It is a fundamental human right. And that's what she said. I want to give a shout out to a book that just came out that I have started to read but haven't finished yet, but it's great so far. It's called Vanguard, and it's by Dr. Martha Jones of Johns Hopkins, but it's specifically looking at Black women and the right to vote and the ways that, they were not necessarily part of the conventional suffrage movement, but the very important, very real work that people were doing.
Oh, I just love both of your answers. And it takes me back a little bit to a couple of episodes ago when we had Rachel Hodges, the former First Lady, on the podcast, and we were talking about the empowering women and how Columbia, the city of Columbia in South Carolina, has a map that's called the City of Women. And you can walk the City of Women and see all of these women who have been instrumental in this state and the historical benefits of talking about these stories, because so many times we don't know. As Rachel said, whenever you saw something that was written by anonymous, it was probably a woman. And so the only street in Columbia that is honoring a woman is called Lady Street. And that was after Martha Washington. They didn't even use her name, just called it Lady Street. So I really appreciate your insight and your wisdom as you're sharing these stories. Thank you so much. And we did talk a little bit on our last episode about some of the poll issues and hours and that kind of thing. And Lawson, you hit it a little bit about this season of COVID and having to get someone to witness your absentee application. So what would you be able to say, some key pieces of advice that might help our community at the ballot box as we go forward in about 40 days? So Lawson, why don't you hit it first, and then I'll turn it to Charnise.
Absolutely. And one piece of very good news is that people don't have to wait 40 days because in South Carolina, it is one very, very good thing that our state legislature did and our governor signed was to permit all South Carolina voters to vote absentee as an alternative to voting on election day. And there are two ways to vote absentee here in South Carolina. One of them is by mail and one of them is in person. In-person absentee voting begins on October 5th. I believe it's a Monday, but essentially it's the month ahead of the election. And again, every South Carolina voter can go do that. And every South Carolina voter can apply to do absentee by mail. Now, it's recommended that people apply as soon as possible. And once you're getting into mid or later October, you might be getting into a crunch of, do you have time to send off the application and get it back and send off your ballot? But I would encourage absolutely everyone, including people who are concerned about COVID for themselves and including people who just want to protect people in the community, to vote absentee if at all possible. There's a central location at County Square. There are going to be 4 more satellite absentee locations in the latter half of October. Again, we'll have a resource sheet to give those details for people. But voting absentee in person is a way to get your own vote in a way that will limit exposure compared to how it's going to be on election day, where we think it will be crowded. And it also means, Charnise made a point in the prior episode about voting with a mind on other people. I think in addition to considering yourself, also consider if you vote absentee, you clear a space on election day for someone who didn't have that opportunity. So I think for everybody, vote absentee if possible.
I love that. That's awesome. How about you, Charnise? Anything else that you want to add to that?
Yeah, I'll add to that. So Lawson gave the great things for before, I would say. And so if we're going to, if an elderly person is going to, or anyone really is going to be at the polling place on election day, I would say that you want to locate your voting place, especially if it's your first time voting, before time, right? So have that paperwork ready, know where you're going, have planned that out already. I would say review those voting materials, make sure that you've got it right. I know that sounds crazy. This has never happened to me personally, but I have heard about people who've had their polling place kind of switched in the last hour, it feels like. So make sure that you're keeping an eye on that. And that is one thing I can say that South Carolina does do a great job of. If you have access to internet and Wi-Fi, is that, you can log in and you can find out those things really, really quickly by just putting in your name and your birthday, which is very, very helpful. I would say coordinate that transportation, make a plan, right? So making a plan is going to be key ahead of time. And when I say make a plan, I'm not saying make it a week before, a day before. I mean, if you have to wait until then to make that plan because of your circumstances, I totally understand that. But if you can make that plan today, as you're listening to this and as you get off hearing this podcast, you can make that plan today and get that plan and verbalize that plan to someone. That is so much more likely that you're going to do it just because you put words, right? You put the words to it. So make that plan, coordinate the transportation, check the materials beforehand, know where you're going to go and vote already. Go during a time of day that other people aren't as likely to be there. As Lawson said, it's going to be a busy election day likely, but you know that most people are going to try and go likely early in the morning before work, midday during that lunch break, and then right after work, right? So if you have the opportunity to go during one of those time frames that's not those, let's do it. Why not? Again, we can clear a space for someone else who had to go to work and has no other choice but to go early in the morning or late in the afternoon or during their lunch break. And then turn voting into like a special occasion in a day. I mean, it's a day for me. It's a whole thing. I have a whole tradition that I do. So we go and we actually vote as a family, and then we just kind of hang out. We take personal days, or either I'm off as an educator, luckily, but we take personal days and we just kind of hang out with one another and just reflect and talk about, what voting has meant to our family, and not just our, immediate family, but our extended family as well, and people who have done work in our family to advance this right for other people and for themselves. And it's just an exciting time. We just make it a thing. So I just feel like making it a fun thing, I'm so excited. This is the first year that we're actually planning on bringing my niece. I know that sounds crazy. We are doing election day voting, but we're going to go during those down times. But yeah, she actually is pictured during the special election, actually, with me after I had voted in that and with her little I voted sticker. And so I'm excited that she'll be with her little mask and everything. It's going to be, it's a to-do. We want to create memories with those young people, and with your, grandparents. Maybe they could tell you a story about their first time voting. So it's an opportunity to make it a thing.
I appreciate that so much. And I love how in our first episode, you talked about your first memory was fear and mothballs and not good smells. And now you have truly redeemed it. I think that's wonderful. I vote with my family as well. We have been in the voting line with all of my girls, and it's been fabulous. So it's been a lot of fun to be able to do that. And I'm so grateful for that heritage that you are giving your niece as well. All right. So Lawson, you've self-proclaimed Gen Xer here. But in the 2018 midterm election, Gen Xers, Z's, millennials collectively outvoted boomers by 2%. So how do communities, clubs, organizations, and schools help engage and sustain this population of society toward voting? So Lawson, what do you think?
So I do a lot of talking to schools, a lot of talking to high school and college age people. And as we had mentioned, I have my own college age children. If I've cracked the code on speaking to college age people, I don't know. I'm not aware of it. I do think this, though. I think that if you look at the data, what you see is that people generally take time. Generations generally start out at relatively low voting rates, and then it increases over time, and that's consistent. And I mention that because I think it's very easy. And I, as a Gen Xer, am now of the population where I'm starting to be a little get off my lawn-y, and so it's easy to be a little bit like, oh, kids these days just don't vote as much as we did. But actually, when we were their age, we didn't either. And I think that the reasons for that, Charnise mentioned sort of developing a family tradition of voting. And that's, of course, so powerful and so important because we have every reason to think that voting is a learned behavior and a habitual behavior. And that the more that people see it as something that they do, they're going to start doing it and step into it. One thing that we did see in 2018 that was extremely good news from the wanting people to vote front was that Gen Z jumped in at a higher voting rate than is typically the case. So typically, I think early stage voters jump in about 20% participation rate. They jumped right in at 30%. But also there's room for improvement in that the oldest demographics of voters vote at substantially higher rates. And again, like they now have a long history of voting, but there continues to be this gap, which means things like older voters, because they're more likely voters, are more likely to be catered to by elected officials. So I don't know exactly what the message to young voters is. I'll tell you what I think. One is to make points like that plain, that nobody can represent your interests but you, and you have generational interests, including you're probably less worried about prescription drug prices compared to 65-year-olds. You're probably more worried about the climate crisis. Generally, again, speaking categorically, not everybody is the same. You're probably more focused on student debt policy, than you are on, certain other things. And again, I think for everybody, once we connect the dots of the issues we really care about to the elected officials who are making the decisions about those issues, I think that's most likely to be empowering. I also think that the most effective student reaching efforts are student-led efforts, so that one of the most powerful things that we can do, anyone, is to facilitate. I mean, to me as a grown-up, I think, I'm better as a co-conspirator with student-led efforts than I am with, barging in and trying to set it up. So I think identifying and supporting existing student-led efforts is probably one of the best ways to go.
Charnise, you're about to explode. Tell us that.
Yes, I'll have to second what Lawson just said. The onus has got to be on the individual within the group, right? So I don't really have much to say about Gen X because I'm not Gen X, right? So I would say all those things that Lawson said are great, but it's like, because I'm not in that group, it's hard for me to speak to how do I keep them engaged and sustained, because that has got to be on people within that group, right? And I can support that as a millennial. And so most of mine comes to me and my thoughts as a millennial myself. So how do communities, clubs, organizations, schools help to engage and sustain that population of millennials? I think that our voices, the things that we are advocating and the things that we want to be done have to be heard, listened to, and taken action upon, right? So lip service is no longer good enough for my generation, the millennials, and then also these Gen Z students who are coming that I'm teaching right now. They're done with that. They really are crossing several sections, and it almost doesn't make sense. You're like, how can you be this and you also want this and this and this? Because they're creating their own thing. They are not going to, I don't think, be satisfied with the status quo right now that we have of the two-party system. I can tell you right now, I'm teaching them, and they're I don't know. I think within their generation, they're gonna create their own third party through grassroots movements, because they are doing the grassroots movements, right? It's not like they're just saying, we want this and we want you to give it to us. The onus, they understand, is on them to do something, and they are doing it. And so as I was talking about, being on the part of this podcast, I actually reached out to a couple of my students and asked them, how do you stay connected? And they said the same thing. They just want the adults in the room to listen to them, and to, even if we're wrong, that's okay. Tell us that you disagree with us and why. Let's have a actual coherent conversation about these things, because when we hear and feel our voices being honored and listened to, then we're more willing to continue that dialogue and to be engaged. But when we see a system that you're telling us to engage in, but every time we do, we kind of get smacked down or put in our place and told that this is not your place, that you're doing too much, then why would I want to participate in a system like that? At the end of the day, what I want to do instead is to upend that system. So if we're not going to invite them in at equal level to the table, right, when they are eligible voters and their vote counts just like ours as a Gen Xer and a millennial and boomers as well, if our votes all count evenly and equally, then why don't they get an equal chance to express the things that are on their hearts? Because as Lawson has already stated, the things that they are probably thinking about are likely a lot different than those other generations, because those are the things that concern them. And so I think that just being willing to hear and take action in regards to the things that are on their hearts are just going to be a key thing in keeping them engaged. And the more that communities and clubs and organizations and schools can do that, the better off I think we'll be in that conversation. I think another student had brought up that they actually was like, well, it was really cool when someone came to our school and talked about the voting and everything. And they was like, I think it was called maybe the League of Women Voters. And I said, yes. And I was able to tell them that they were coming again real soon to our school. And they were like, oh, that's so great. And it was just, I mean, that's it. I mean, that is proof in the pudding. You may think that their eyes are glazed over, Lawson, as you're talking to them, that they're not maybe hearing you, but they are listening, and they may not fully be resonating, because at that time, that particular student, she was not able to vote, but she remembers it. And now it matters because this year she is eligible to vote. You see, planting those seeds early is a major key to me as well.
I think that's so true. And if I may, follow off what Charnise has said, one thing that really should have been obvious to me, but hit me in a way that ultimately resonated, is the vote is treated kind of like a sacred cow. It's treated kind of like, the right to vote, it's so sacred. Well, I mean, the right to vote is a tool, right? It's not an end in itself. The value of the vote is what it does for you, what it gets you. That's the reason for having it. It's not like, there's a movie and you get the right to vote and then like, yay, right? Like that's not the end point. The point is what comes after, when the vote is one of the tools that you use to accomplish the ends that you want in civic society.
Well said. Well said. I really appreciate both of you and the idea of focusing on generational issues and also marrying that with action. Just so key. So let's move on to another question. And you all have been talking about it a little bit when we talk about equality and voting systems and some of the inequalities. But there is a lack of consistency within our states as far as voting rules and policies. That's been established. There has been an effort attempted to create equity within the 1965 Voting Rights Act. But then in 2015, the U.S. Supreme Court gave states more freedom to change voting regulations by banning pre-clearance, which is the process of seeking the U.S. Department of Justice approval for all changes related to voting. And it was interesting because we're talking about a beloved heroine of justice, Ruth Bader Ginsburg, and she wrote the dissent, as Charnise has already talked about, that being such a powerful word, dissent. But she wrote this. She said, throwing out pre-clearance when it has worked and is continuing to work to stop discriminatory changes is like throwing away your umbrella in a rainstorm because you are not getting wet. So what is the role of the federal government in ensuring our voting systems are equal and accessible for all voters? And then what needs to change going forward? So Lawson, I'm going to toss it to you first.
So you figure the goal is to have safe and accessible elections. That's the goal. One of the ways to reach that goal is through the federal government. They clearly have the power to require that. And, you know, if you look to Justice Ginsburg's point of not throwing away the umbrella, what you can see quite clearly is as soon as there was that decision, that Shelby v. Holder decision that, you know, effectively removed the pre-clearance requirement, and then the deluge, right? Immediately discriminatory vote suppressive measures came raining down full force, both in the states that had previously been subject to pre-clearance, which were the states that had had a long historical pattern of race-related voter discrimination, voter oppression, but also in other ones. This is a problem that is not just in the states that were subject to pre-clearance, it's in a lot of them. But absolutely, the federal government can take action to do that. It's also the case here in South Carolina that our state legislature could take action to do that. One little just fascinating fact, I think. I know in the last episode, Charnise had mentioned voter IDs as an example of voter suppression. And that is such a great example of voter suppression because the argument for having a photo voter ID is that it prohibits or reduces the risk of in-person voter fraud. Okay. Also, in-person voter fraud is not a thing. Right? It's like there is no problem of in-person voter fraud. There's no substantial evidence at all of in-person voter fraud. So there's no basis for an argument to support the need for an additional hoop for people to jump through in providing a photo ID, but it does tend to have a vote suppressive effect. Here in South Carolina, the League of Women Voters was one of the organizations that sued, against there being a voter ID laws. We lost. We lost at the appellate level, which was the local federal court of appeals, and the person who authored the decision was Brett Kavanaugh. So we have a Kavanaugh connection. Isn't that cute?
That's a word, cute. Okay, we'll let that one be. Charnise, I'm gonna have you give an answer to that one.
Yes, what I would have to say, the role of the federal government in ensuring our voting systems are equal and accessible for all eligible voters is the role that our federal government has to play in it is the whole role. It's their job, literally. I know it sounds crazy, but it is literally the federal government's job to ensure this truth. It is the reason that we have a federalism, right, where we divide some things to the state and we give some things to the federal government. But at the end of the day, the Supremacy Clause gives the federal government, right, the full ability to be the last say of the land. And the last say of the land is that due to the 15th Amendment, all people are guaranteed their ability to vote. And so the federal government has to ensure that. That's the federal government's job. So anytime the federal government is not involved in that business is an issue, right? And so that's when you, to Lawson's point, when these things began to be curtailed, and to your point at the beginning too, Amy, when these things began to be curtailed, right? The House had the Voting Rights Achievement Act, right? The Voting Rights Act that they were trying to restore the things that had been taken out of the 1965 Voting Rights Act. And then recently, right, that has been renamed John R. Lewis Voting Rights Act of 2020, right? So that's something that has happened, that is working its way through the processes, right? It's already been approved in the House and it's waiting to go and to be hopefully approved in the Senate. I'm crossing my fingers. You guys couldn't see me do that. But to restore those things that were taken out of the Voting Rights Act of 1965, those pre-clearance things that you spoke about, which are so important because without those, it leaves it up to the states. And unfortunately, some states are just going to do some of those backroom dealings that we already talked about in order to curtail people's ability to exercise their rights to vote by putting in nebulous different types of laws and requirements in order to limit those people who can to be able to exercise their rights to vote. And the federal government has to be involved in ensuring that that does not happen. And when the federal government is not doing it, it's not doing its job, and it's up to us, the people, to ensure that it does by voting. Those of us who are not having our rights obstructed by these nebulous things, then we have got to vote, as I've stated before, not only with our own selves in mind, but also with marginalized people in mind as well. And so what I think needs to change as we go forward is that people need to be more responsive. I just think it's such a sad truth. But then sometimes I think that it may be the kind of culmination of this rugged individualism that we have as almost a core value in America. Individualism means that you're on your own, that it's about you. And I just don't think that for me personally is any way to be. If it's just all about you, that to me is selfish. But I feel like maybe we're coming into some of the culmination of that kind of thinking when people are willing to say, not only does my vote not matter for me and I'm willing to not vote, but also it doesn't matter for my children, my children's children, for my neighbor, for my coworker whom I love. It's not even worth it for me to vote on their behalf. And I think that needs to change as we move forward, that we need to think beyond ourselves and we need to think about others in every area of life.
Both of these are beautiful answers. I mean, the idea of the right to vote is a tool, and that we balance that individualism with our communities in order to promote change. And the fact that this episode is on the power of the vote. So you both have explained its immense power. And I really appreciate the way you have brought that to light. I think sometimes in our everyday world, when we think about voting, we don't think about that power. And I really appreciate the way you both have brought that to light. So Charnise and Lawson, we have a signature question here at the Afterword table. And I'm not going to call on one of you first. You're just going to have to jump in. Whoever feels I'm already seeing the shaking of the head. But what is a metaphor that helps us understand the power of the vote?
I have one for this. The metaphor for me is water, because I think that for me, it's helpful to think of each of our votes as a drop of water. And that can seem insignificant. Like, what difference is a drop of water? What are you going to do? Like, drown somebody with a drop of water? It can feel very insignificant and easy to dismiss. But for one thing, there are situations where a single drop of water makes all the difference. That absolutely happens. And also, the power of water collectively is massive, right? Without contributing your own drop of water, there are no streams, there are no rivers, there are no waterfalls, there are no oceans. And collectively, that water has tremendous power.
Charnise.
Oh, so many things are kind of going through my head for this one. I actually thought about it, but nothing came. But as Lawson just said, water, my next knee-jerk reaction is kind of like fire. I know that sounds crazy, especially with everything that's going on with fires for our brothers and sisters out west. But the thing that is interesting about fire is that the vote can go crazy and wild and do some real destructive damage, right? But it also has the power to bring forth this ability to the Native Americans of the indigenous people of this land knew a thing or two about fire. They used fire to burn down overgrown areas in a very intentional way, where they came together as a community and intentionally set different fires that would essentially meet, burn, and then burn out and allow for new and fresh vegetation to happen. And I think of the power of the vote being like that, being like the indigenous people of this land and using our power, our vote to intentionally move forward and do some things that you may be thinking, I don't know what I'm doing. And you may think, is this the best choice? Is this going to be destructive? But then when we all put our individual pieces, like that water that Lawson was talking about, together, and they kind of meet, and that fire meets and comes together into this like almost like glorious thing, and then disintegrates, there's this opportunity for, after we have voted, for there to be a new forged opportunity for our country. And I just love it.
That's beautiful. Fire and water. Way to go, ladies. That's so amazing. That's why we love this question, because a lot of us have that creative mindset. We think about words and we think about stories. We put it in a metaphor and people get it. Like, our listeners won't forget drops, waterfall. Our listeners will not forget the vote and the power of fire, and how that one spark of a vote can ignite a change. Thank you all so much. This has been amazing. And we hate that we had to lose Holland for this episode, but we know that this was definitely a episode that was near and dear to his heart as well. Lawson, where can we learn about your work?
The League of Women Voters of Greenville County has a website. I believe it's at mylwv.org is one way to do it. And also in the resource sheet, I'm very happy for people to contact me personally and happy to share that information, because the goal is to be a resource.
Wonderful. Well, we will definitely link that to our show notes for sure. How about you, Charnise? How can people get a hold of you?
People can get a hold of me in a host of different ways. The best way to do that is going to be to go to my website, www.charnisemangle.com, which is going to be in the show notes. And also, you can always reach me on Instagram as well. But these days, I will be honest, I have taken a little bit of a sabbatical, but I'll be back. Likely by the time you are listening to this, I'll be back, because I got to get out there and talk about getting out there to get the vote. So we'll be there.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. This has been such an instructive and fun conversation about the power of the vote. And we are so grateful to have Charnise Mangle and Lawson Wetli here with us at the Afterword table. Please join us next week as we talk about hunger in our world and the stories that we hear from that situation where we find, especially in times of COVID, so many are experiencing hunger in ways that we would never have imagined, and how this pandemic has impacted that need. So please make sure you leave us a review, rate us on iTunes, Apple Podcasts, become a subscriber to theafterwordpodcast.com. It does help us keep the conversations going. And as always, remember, you are welcome at our table.